here is the agenda. We're going to be covering these topics. Of course, I made it very simple. I don't want to actually exhaust you with the number of use cases that we're going to talk about in this webinar. There are so many things that needs to be covered. So stay tight. And before we get onto it, as Rigo mentioned, I want you to participate in the Slido. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds for you to scan and participate in the Slido, because the next one is going to be coming up with a poll question, which is going to be helpful for us to understand how is your journey with an identity stores. I'm going to give a few more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So I want you to actually understand which ID stores do you use. Very good. Very good. Wow, this is amazing. The Active Directory is the winner. Okay, I don't see much of the traction. I'm gonna actually take it to our next introduction topic. So the next the one that I'm gonna be starting up with, as you have seen in our poll questions itself, people are actually moving from on-prem Active Directory to Entra. Microsoft introduced a solution, a cloud-based solution called Entra for your on-prem Active Directory solutions. All the workloads are supposed to be migrated to Entra before you sunset your Active Directory. So during the migration process, you might actually maybe using both Active Directory and Entra, and which we're going to call it as hybrid environment, because you are making use of both Active Directory and Entra. So there are people who might be making use of an Entra, who might be making use of Active Directory alone, who might be making use of both of them. So as per our ISE telemetry information, the poll actually talks about it even. 75%, more than 75% of the people were making use of an Active Directory with an ISE. But over a period of time, Entra ID adoption is also actually getting increased. As you could see from a 2022 to till date, there has been a significant increase. But of course, don't go by the numbers. These are not the actual numbers, but these are the numbers that we're going to receive as per the telemetry, which are going to be enabled or based on the reachability from an ISE standpoint. So my entire session, this session, is going to be concentrating on the Entra ID integration solutions that are possible. This was already available in the community article that was already provided by Greg. So please go through that detailed steps involved into it. And anyway, I'm going to be covering all the aspects over here. Now, when Microsoft introduced Entra for an Active Directory, but Entra ID is not an Active Directory. It's not equivalent to Active Directory. The reason, we're going to see those reasons now. But of course, this is not the topic to cover the entire Entra ID versus an on-prem Active Directory. I'm going to be giving the highlights of it at this point of time. So the traditional Active Directory is intended for the corporate Windows machines natively to be managed via group policy or an SCCM. SCCM is a centralized management for your users and computer accounts being managed in the Active Directory. You could also make use of our user group policies in order to push the policies onto the managed devices. Natively, only Windows can be actually joined to the Active Directory. And that is an on-prem, or you can even host it on the cloud environment. But whereas Entra, it's a cloud, purely cloud solution. And you could make use of an Intune in order to actually manage the devices. manage the devices, joined devices. When I say joined devices, there is a difference basically. If you look at compare the traditional Active Directory versus an Entra, there is no concept of bringing your own devices or a personal devices management. But Entra ID has provided a solution for you to even give the access to the resources that is being accessed over the personal devices. So you have a corporate assets, you have a personal devices, and the corporate assets can be managed via Entra. That is, all the configuration and the policies can be pushed from the Intune. But whereas your personal devices like Apple, Android, where you wanted to give the access to the cloud resources like a Microsoft Office 360, etc., they can be registered. So based on the personal devices versus the corporate device, the joining to the Entra is going to be different. That's the reason why we called it out as a multi-join point. That's a significant difference between the Active Directory and the Entra ID. So now that we have touched based on the Entra ID join types, let's double click on that aspect. So in Entra, you could have a managed devices. The Windows devices could be joined to the Entra, and you can basically manage those policies, configuration, push the profiles, everything based on the Intune tool that was provided within Entra itself. Those devices, managed or corporate devices, are going to be called as joined devices. Whereas the personal devices, from an organization standpoint, I don't want to, as an administrator, I don't want to manage those devices. But at the same time, I wanted to give the access to the resources, probably Office 365, SharePoint, or any cloud resources from those personal devices being brought up by the employees. When you are trying to onboard these personal devices against Entra, you can register them. It's not a joined device. So these are called registered devices. Registered devices, you don't want to manage it. It's basically to give the access to the resources. If you have a hybrid environment, you can actually club both of them, like personal and organization devices, with both group policies, SCCM and Intune together in order to actually manage all these devices. That's an advantage of a customer who is making use of both an Active Directory and an Entra at the same time. This is one of the difference, and there is one more difference. From an ISE protocols, even the Active Directory standpoint also, it supports, these are the protocols that were supported by the ISE as well as the IAD integration. You have a legacy protocols like a PEAP, MSCHAP v2, MSCHAP v1, EAP-FAST, EAP-TTLS, TEAP. All these protocols are supported against the Active Directory. But however, let's take an example of a PEAP MSCHAP v2. Why is it not actually incompatible with, not compatible with an Entra? So I'm taking one of the protocol as an example here. When the device is participating in the EAP negotiation during the network connection, basically it forms a PEAP tunnel with the help of ISE EAP certificate. And within that outer tunnel, PEAP tunnel, you're going to be actually sending the password hash rather than actually sending the password as is. So that's the algorithm, what we call it as MSCHAP v2. Now, the password hash, which was received by the ISE, is going to be sent out to the Active Directory. And based on that MSCHAP v2 algorithm and NTLM protocols, it's going to validate and then give the authorization. But if you replace the Active Directory for the same protocol with an Entra, of course, it's not supported because Entra doesn't support an NTLM. And even because of a credentials card, MSCHAP v2 is also not allowed. So because of that reason, you could find that the protocols which were supported on the Entra ID for a .1x authentication is also actually limited. You could clearly differentiate, clearly see the difference between the Active Directory protocol support versus the Entra ID. The last one, like a EAP-TTLS+PAP ROPC, Resource Owner Password Credentials Mechanism. That's what we're going to make use of for the .NET authentication. But for the rest of the protocols, we're going to be relying on the authorization alone, not the authentication. And what exactly that ROPC is, and why can't we make use of ROPC mechanism for other protocols? ROPC was actually based on the RFC 6749. It's called Resource Owner Password Credentials. It's purely password based. The client who is something like an ISE is supposed to have the password credentials and to be trusted in the Entra in order to actually, on behalf of the client, it can get authenticated and authorized against Entra straight away. Because it is a password mechanism, you cannot make use of GTC like a token based or a certificate mechanism over ROPCs. So that was the reason why not all the protocols are supported. 802.1x protocols are not supported. Not all the 802.1x protocols are supported using the ROPC mechanism. And one of the last, but I wanted to make a little note over here. When we were maintaining the user accounts and the computer accounts in Active Directory versus an Entra, there is a difference. Like you have seen, Active Directory is going to make use of a group policies or an SCCM in order to manage the user and computer accounts, but Intune is going to be used for managing the corporate assets. So let's see those differences. If it is an Active Directory, you're going to make use of a group policy or an SCCM, but whereas an Entra, you're going to make use of an Intune. In order to differentiate the device user accounts, you have a significant attribute difference. Of course, there are so many attributes that are maintained in both the Active Directory and an Entra, but a computer account in Active Directory is not equivalent to the Entra ID device. We call it as Entra ID device, not the computer account like you are maintaining in the Active Directory. So the computer account might be notified, or probably you can actually find the properties of it, like using the SAM account name, distinguished name, object SID, etc. But in the Entra, you're going to find it as a device ID. And each device ID is going to be represented using the GUID parameter. The user property is also going to be a little different. And when you are making use of a hybrid environment versus Entra ID alone, you're going to see a lot of differences even. So those are the major differences that I wanted to actually talk from the ISE standpoint or a NAC standpoint. With that, let's understand what are the ISE features introduced for an Entra ID solutions alone. Before that, I wanted to actually let you know I wanted to start with the ISE versions. Of course, the 3.0 journey was started way back in 2020. 3.1 and 3.2 was called end of life already just 1 month or 1.5 months back. And a 3.3 P4 is the latest and the suggested release at this point of time. 3.4, 3.4 P1, 3.5 beta is already happening. 3.5, you can anticipate a 3.5 GA release probably in a 1 month or a 1.5 month. So with that, let's understand what are the features that we have introduced in Cisco ISE for an Entra ID integrations. So 3.0, we started off the journey with the cloud integrations, wherein you can deploy Cisco ISE over the Azure VMware cloud. And the 802.1x authentication got started using the ROPC, but with just the EAP-TTLS mechanism alone. The SAML 2.0 for all the portals, only except the admin portal, was supported even from a 3.0 standpoint. If you look at from a 3.1, we moved in order to eliminate the MAC randomization, docking stations, or a dongle MAC addresses or MAC randomization problem. We moved on to the MDM version 3, and that MDM version 3 APIs were introduced in 3.1. 3.0 and 3.1 P3, we have also adopted to the Graph API support rather than Azure Active Directory APIs, which was actually the legacy APIs being used in the Entra. In 3.2, these are the three features, major features. You can authenticate the devices and users over EAP-TLS and the TEAP EAP-TLS mechanism, but authentication is happening within ISE. The authorization is happening against an Entra. And you can even natively deploy ISE from an Azure environment. Admin portal SAML support is introduced even in this 3.2 timeframe. For these features, we already did so many webinars around it, and I want to actually just call them out so that you can refer them later point of time. How do I deploy ISE in Azure, probably over a VMware cloud or natively? How do you even upgrade? How do you even use it in a hybrid cloud environment? And how do you make use of a cloud-based load balancers? All these were already done in the earlier webinars. Even with the Intune as well, we have done 2 more webinars, and you can refer them later point of time. And this session is basically talking about these 4 points: SAML, ROPC, EAP-TLS, and the TEAP authorization, and probably on top of it Intune. And we're going to see the hybrid integrations also. Before we dive into these respective features, highlighting features, let's look at the 3.1 and 3.2. 3.2 and 3.1 end of maintenance is going to happen in 2026 November. So as much as early as possible, you might want to actually upgrade your environment if you're there in these ISE versions. Now with that, let's go ahead with the SAML 2.0 IDP portal integrations. But before diving into the SAML portal integrations right away, oh God, I just figured it out on this. So I wanted to actually talk about the SAML versus 8.2.1x. It's a chicken and egg problem. The reason behind that is, as a user, if I wanted to actually access any resource, something like ISE guest portal, ISE sponsor portal, ISE or any portal, in order for me to access that resource, the SAML basically it's a browser mechanism over which you're going to be accessing those resources. That means as an end user or a device, I'm supposed to have an access, a limited access, at least to reach out to the Entra IDP or a SAML IDP. So basically, you're going to be accessing the resource, which in turn takes you to the SAML IDP. And once this SAML IDP authentication is passed, then the token is going to be exchanged so that the authorization is going to be given back to the browser. The resource, like ISE guest portals, admin portals, sponsor portals, or BYOD portals. But whereas in the 8.2.1x case, until and unless the authentication has happened, the authorization is not going to happen over 8.2.1x. So this is a chicken and egg problem. Like 8.2.1x was asking you to authenticate before even you get the network access. But whereas SAML requires you to have some kind of a limited network access in order for you to redirect to Entra ID. This is especially for the network access admission. It's very, very important. It might be actually easy from the application access, but from a network admission control, if you're making use of a SAML, this is going to be a very important one to be considered. Now let's understand how it's going to work, the SAML against an Entra. Now, the ones you are connected to the Wi-Fi or probably connect to one of the switch port, the ISE is supposed to give you some kind of a limited access so that you can redirect to the respective guest or a sponsor, BYOD or whatever it is. Once after you are redirected to the respective portal, the portal was associated to the SAML IDP so that you are again redirected to the Entra SAML IDP page. Once the authentication is provided, of course, MFA is no more an optional piece from the Entra side. MFA is supposed to be enabled starting from June onwards. So you might be having some lenience on the MFA part of it from the Entra earlier, but it has to be enabled, and Entra was already asking you to enforce the MFA part of it. So once the MFA was done, the SAML response you're going to be receiving, ISE is going to be receiving, and based on the SAML assertion response that ISE receives, the authorization is going to be given to those respective portals that you're trying to access. Now let's see it in the action. I have taken a guest portal association to SAML IDP as an example, and I'm going to be covering that. So let's start off with by going to the external identity source. Let's click on add. You're just adding a dummy SAML IDP by giving a name to it, Entra SAML, or probably Entra SAML underscore guest. Save the configuration. You don't have to actually do anything at this point of time. You just have to associate to one of the guest portal. So I was making use of a sponsored guest portal, which was duplicated earlier, and I've given it a name called as Entra SAML. Instead of pointing to the guest portal sequence authentication sequence, I'm pointing now to the Entra so that the login is being represented as an SSO now. Now the portal is being associated to the SAML IDP that you have just configured as a dummy one. Now it requires an additional configuration. Go to the service provider, and you could clearly see that what are the portals that you have associated to it. Export the configuration, and this is going to give you a zip file wherein it's going to contain the XML file plus, let's extract it, and you have a README plus an XML file. So if you open it up, the XML file, you're going to find the entity ID. The entity ID is important piece for you to refer as a service provider, identity provider information. So I was making use of one of the enterprise application already configured in my Entra. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, assign the groups or users. Already I see that there are so many groups, Cisco, employee, guest. The groups are associated to this application. And let's go to the single sign-on. Let's copy this entity ID with the latest one. And you have this login response also. Once after SAML assertion is completed, to which portal it is supposed to give the response back. That is the assertion. So you're going to be pasting that and save the configuration. And you can see that apart from just the groups alone, I've also actually configured some of the claims so that I can configure them. You can download this configuration, the SAML federated XML file, and you can associate to identity provider config. Any certificate is going to be part of this XML file, so it will get added to your trusted store. Now, the next one is to associate the groups. I'm just taking as an example, employee group. Where is that employee group? There are so many groups available. So I'm going to be going ahead and copying that object ID, adding that group. In the assertion response, you're going to receive that as an identity. So, but in ISE, you can actually name it as an employee for your policies and for easiness. Coming down to attributes also, as you could see, we have so many claims made as part of the SAML assertion. So let's go back to that application again. Let's see what are the attributes that I could make use of as part of the SAML assertion. So under single sign-on itself, you could see that attributes and claims are available, like location, department, compliance, on-premise, etc. So I'm going to be adding something like a department as a one of the parameter. So as long as guest belongs to so-and-so department or an employee belongs to so-and-so department. So that's the configuration. And let's now move down to the policies. The way we configure the policies, already, if at all it is a MAP authentication, it's being redirected to guest SAML page. But on top of it, I want to actually create all the, once the guest authentication is successful over Entra SAML IDP, I wanted to make use of those groups and attributes configured now. Entra SAML, as long as the groups, I wanted to make use of groups as long as it belongs to employee group. Instead of giving the guest redirect, now I'm going to be giving the probably guest access itself. Assign the guest SGT. So that's the configuration you're supposed to actually look for from the Entra side, from the ISE side. And now let's go down to the endpoint, which was already connected to the network. And you could see that it is being redirected and redirected to the Entra IDP. The moment you got connected over wireless or a wired environment, it was already being redirected to the Entra SAML IDP. I'm supposed to provide the user. And once the MFA was already done earlier, that was the reason why it was not asking me now. Otherwise, it would have been asking me MFA too. So you could clearly see that the authentication was successful. And as part of the Entra SAML IDP response, we received that Pavan at ISE partnership on Microsoft.com is part of an employee group, and we were able to give the employee access, or guest access. But even though I mentioned it as an employee _ SAML IDP, okay, so that's how it works. Now let's see how it works in the SAML for an admin page portal. Remember one thing: the guest one, you need a guest portal, sponsor portal, or a BYOD portal. You need one single SAML IDP. But whereas if you're trying to configure an admin portal for the same SAML IDP, then you need a separate SAML. That's a limitation on the ISE part of it. So keep that in mind. So how do I do admin login from the Entra SAML IDP? So as I was mentioning, the first thing is to create a dummy SAML IDP. I'm going to name it as SAML admin. Save the configuration. Go to the admin access, system admin access. So instead of internal now, I'm going to be moving down to the SAML admin. As SAML IDP. Then I'm going to go to the external identity source, SAML IDP, which was just configured SAML admin SAML IDP. Now you can actually export this XML file. Now this exported XML file is going to contain the entity ID and the responses separately. So if you extract the same thing, let's open it up in the notepad. And you can see that there is an entity ID. Copy it. Let's now go to the Entra and create one application. So I was making use of earlier, I was making use of an existing SAML application, but now I wanted to create my own application. This allows you to actually create an application as well. How do I create an application in the Entra? So I'm going to create my own application by naming it as SAML ISE admin. Then assign the group. Again, I'm going to make use of an employee. Of course, I could make use of another group, but this is just for a demonstration purpose. Go to the single sign-on, configure the SAML, Now, because it is a fresh configuration, you don't find an entity ID and the reply URL assertion response. So you need to, again, go back to the notepad, copy that assertion response URL. You could clearly see that there is a difference between the guest SAML response versus the admin SAML response. This is the reason why uh, you need a different SAML IDPs. Now that a SAML configuration was attached, let's go ahead and add some group claims to it. So I wanted to understand in which group that the user belongs to. That's part of a SAML response I wanted to get back. And the claim name is nothing but I need to copy that claim name. This is the claim name. Got copied. Let's move ahead to downloading that federation metadata XML file. Let's move back to the ISE identity provider configuration and associate the SAML ISE federated XML file. Save the configuration. Now I wanted to associate if Pavan is the user who belongs to the employee group. If Pavan is getting logged in as an admin into the admin portal, I wanted to actually get the SAML response, a session response as an employee group. So we're going to be making use of employee object ID again. If we get that employee object ID as part of a SAML response, then I wanted to associate as a super admin group. This is also one of the differentiating difference why we need another SAML IDP than making use of a same IDP. So if I log out, now you could clearly see that there is an option for me to log in using this SAML. This will redirect me to the SAML page, SAML IDP, Entra IDP. I'm going to make use of the same user, Pavan at icepartnership.onmicrosoft.com. Give the password. Then, because it is now authorized as part of an authorization response, a SAML assertion response, we got employee group ID, and that ID was already associated to admin group, super admin group. So that is the reason why you're able to see all the pages, menu pages. So he became the super admin. Even if I log out and log in back again, because the cookie is going to be maintained in your browser, obviously it's not going to ask for again to authenticate until and unless you close it or the token is gets expired. So that's how you basically do this SAML association, SAML IDP association with the portals in order to give the network access or in order to get into the admin portals or a guest portal, etc. Now, let's get into this second aspect, EAP-TTLS, the ROPC. Why PAP, plain text format? The reason behind that is basically the RFC itself says it is based on the password, and the password, which on behalf of client, ICE is supposed to, on behalf of device, ICE is supposed to actually get that password and then submit over the REST call. That was the reason why it's going to work only with the PAP and EAP-TTLS mechanism, and it doesn't work with all other mechanisms. And let's see it in the flow diagram how it works. So initially, when the endpoint goes through the negotiation associating to the network, it goes through the EAP negotiation, of course. And once after that, it forms an EAP-TTLS tunnel, outer tunnel, using the ICE EAP certificate. And within that tunnel, you're going to be sending the PAP credentials. That means your credit password. And the password and the username is going to be submitted over the REST call using the ROPC mechanism in order to get authenticated, plus retrieve the groups and attributes if at all authentication is successful. So based on the retrieved attributes and groups and created policies, ICE is going to give the authorization to it. Confused? Let's see it in the action. So I'm going to be actually starting my demonstration by showcasing how do we create an application first of all. So let's create an application in Entra for an EAP-TTLS+PAP mechanism. Just give it a name. Then you might have to copy this client ID and tenant ID when we were configuring the REST ID store in the ISE. So you might have to copy them and keep it separate. And you might have to enable the ROPC, which is by default not enabled in the application. So you have to actually enable it. And we have to associate the ISE certificate and ISE relevant root certificates. This is my root certificate, which was issuing the ISE certificates also. So I'm going to be uploading that root certificate so that Entra is going to be trusting that certificate too. So in order to grab the groups, we need an application permission to be given to this application. So let's go ahead and give the read all groups permission to it and grant an admin consent so that it can grab the groups from this application. ISE can grab the application. Now go back to the same application, but enterprise one. The reason behind that is we will not be able to associate the groups in the same enterprise application. So I'm going to be going ahead into the users and groups and associating probably 2 or 3 groups. So employee is one group that I wanted to associate. Contractor is another group that I wanted to associate. And if the user belongs to probably, I don't know why I have selected guest. The guest is not going to be relevant here. Contractor and employee. As long as an employee is logging in, how do we need to give the access? And we might have to actually see what are the users associated to employee versus, you could see that Pavan belongs to the employee group, but whereas Intune and test user belongs to the contractor group. So we're going to be using that, and we have already we're going to configure the REST identity store now. So far, you have seen what is the configuration required on the Entra side. Now you're going to see what is the configuration required on the REST on the ISE for the REST mechanism. So the client ID, like I was saying earlier, so you have to copy that client ID. And the next one is tenant ID. Within that tenant, what is the application that you are actually accessing it? And then there is a secret, basically, because it's an ROPC mechanism. As per ROPC, you need a client secret to be trusted. This is the another reason why Microsoft might not recommend this ROPC mechanism too. So you have to copy this client secret so that you are giving client as an application access. Test connection was successful. And now let's go ahead and configure groups also. Let's go ahead and retrieve the groups. Because we have given the API permissions to retrieve all the groups available in the application or available in the tenant. I retrieved all the groups possible, and I'm going to be attaching only these 3 groups. And even you can retrieve the attributes as well from the Entra so that you can basically write the policies based on the attributes also. Once you add them, save the configuration. Now let's move on to the policies part of it. Let's look at the policies too. Now, if I look at the policy sets that I've created, this is the Entra ID use cases policy set that I'm going to be making use throughout this webinar. This was actually for any device that is conducting or authenticating over from any device that I have. It's going to make use of this Entra ID policy set. Especially, I wanted to understand for any EAP-TTLS authentication, I wanted to make use of Entra ID REST store. And if it is part of an employee group, I wanted to give the employee access and employee SGT. If it is part of a contractor group, I wanted to give the restricted access and contractor SGT. So let's see it in the action by authenticating, moving down to the endpoint and authenticating. So if you go to the authentication piece, you have an option to select the EAP-TTLS. Of course, you can enforce these profiles from your SCCM or from your group policies too for the managed devices. And let the authentication be with the user authentication. Now it's prompting me to submit the user credentials. Submit the user credentials. You're not supposed to get this prompt. Oh, authentication failed. So after so many, I mean, this was actually evident. I don't know what is happening. I've tried it from my simulator also, but it is not working. But I have to actually dig deeper into it. But if at all it was successful, you're going to be getting the authorization based on the groups that was part of this user. Because Pavan belongs to employee group, it was supposed to get the employee access. That's my intent of creating all this configuration all along. Now let's move down to the next part of it. The third aspect of it, EAP-TLS and the TEAP EAP-TLS authorization against Entra. Now, EAP-TLS, let's go one by one. EAP-TLS first. EAP-TLS authorization against Entra. You're not doing EAP-TLS authentication against Entra, just to be precise. So the way it works, basically during the EAP negotiation, of course, Radius server ISE is going to send the server certificate. And of course, because it is a EAP-TLS, the devices or users are supposed to submit the user certificate, the cipher, change cipher, and key exchange, so that the Cisco ISE is going to respond back by validating the certificate that you have submitted, and then is confirming the chain cipher specs to it. With that, the EAP-TLS authentication is going to be successful. So the authentication so far is happened within the ISE server itself. But we got, based on the common name or a subject alternative name of this certificate, we can fire up a REST call towards the Entra, get the groups and attributes, and give the authorization to the user or device. The flow is going to be one and the same for TEAP EAP-TLS mechanism, but the TEAP involves a little bit different. I'm going to be touch basing on that. So once after the EAP negotiation, the outer tunnel TEAP is going to be formed using the ISE server EAP certificate. And within that outer tunnel, the endpoint is going to submit this certificate. And the certificate might contain the common name like this, like Pavan Gupta example.on.microsoft.com. Or probably it might be containing the SAN as well. It's based on your certificate authentication profile. You can basically associate either you want to consider common name or a subject alternative name. So once the authentication is done, you're going to be taking that common name, whatever as per the certificate authentication profile that you have associated, that you're going to be extracting that, and you're going to be taking that into consideration to fire up a REST call towards the Entra to retrieve the groups and attributes. And based on the groups and attributes that you have configured in the policies, ISE is going to give the authorization to it. Now, let's see it in the action by taking one of the protocol like EAP-TLS authorization against Entra. So I have a client which was already having the certificate. I'm going into the manage user certificate. If you go to the certificate, you'll find one certificate called Intune, which was given by the Territory Enterprise CA. Of course, Territory Enterprise CA is an intermediate CA. My root CA is Territory root CA. So it's a two-tier CA. And if you look at the additional attributes of this certificate, the common name is Intune, and you have a lot of other attributes under subject alternative name, like GUID, user principal name, and the security identifiers. Now let's look at the policy sets that we could actually create based on this. I've already created a certificate. As long as it is a certificate authentication, we're going to be making use of a certificate authentication profile called, it's going to consider common name or a subject alternative name. So that is what the certificate authentication profile is. And as long as it is part of the contractors group, as part of the response, REST call response, if we receive that it is part of contractors group, I'm giving a restricted access. anything else, I'm going to be giving the employee access. So let's see it in the action by disabling and enabling the adapter of the client machine. It goes through. I hope it's going to work. I think, yes, this time it worked, I guess. So Intune at icepartnership.onmicrosoft.com, EAP-TLS employee. That's a username being extracted from the certificate. Okay. So it's all based on the certificate, whether authentication profile, whether you want to consider the common name or subject alternative name. So subject alternative name is into consideration as part of a subject alternative name. Certificate authentication profile. We have taken that and we are trying to create the Entra ID and get the groups and attributes associated to it. Now, then why am I not giving the demonstration using the TEAP EAP-TLS? The reason behind that is, what is the difference between that TEAP or EAP-TLS mechanism now? You have an additional advantage of making use of a TEAP here. That is nothing but a EAP chaining concept. What is that EAP chaining? Traditionally, if you look at a Windows machine, you can select any protocol. Then as long as it is a computer joined device to Active Directory or an Entra, the user authentication and the computer authentication are two different factors from the Windows standpoint. So that means ISE is going to receive computer authentication separate and user authentication separately. But computer authentication might not happen at all the times whenever you connect to the SSID or whenever you plug into the switch port. It happens only during the reboot or during the boot up or a log of events alone. So the user authentication might happen at every network association. This is the reason why we, because the computer and the user authentication are two different aspects from a Windows world. How do I make sure Pavan is the one who is logging into Pavan Gupta desktop? Pavan is the one who is logging into Pavan Gupta desktop too. So if you want to chain both the computer and the user authentication together, you have to make use of a TEAP protocol natively, which is available natively from a Windows standpoint. The similar chaining concept is also possible from a EAP-FAST protocol, but the EAP-FAST protocol is not natively available on the Windows machine. For that, you might have to make use of a Cisco Secure Client NAM model in order to actually participate in this EAP chaining purpose. Now let's see it in the flow diagram, how it's going to work. Again, the device, when it gets booted up for the first time, or let's say I'm rebooting it for the first time, the computer boots up and it submits the certificate, computer certificate or a device certificate to over the TEAP EAP-TLS mechanism. Taking that certificate, ISE is going to validate that certificate, but at this point of time, user has not submitted any credentials or any certificate so far. Only the machine authentication happened if the certificate validation is successful. Now, once after the boot up, you might be prompting to log into your user account. Once after log into user account, then the user might be presenting the certificate belonging to him. Now, at this point of time, you have both user and machine certificate together in ISE server for validation. So both of them are going to be stitched using the EAP chaining concept, so that as long as my EAP chaining result says user and machine is succeeded, then I can actually give so-and-so policy. As long as my machine is succeeded, but user authentication has failed, then I can give a different authorization. So if both of them are successful, I can make use of the certificate attribute, either common name or a subject alternative name, in order to fire up a graph API against Entra to retrieve the groups and attributes around it, and then get the authorization. Now let's see it in the action, how it works. So I got a Windows machine. This is Intune Pavan machine that I was making use of. This is a user certificate, which was given by, again, my territory enterprise CA, 2-type CA. If you look at it, subject is Pavan. I'm going to make use of a subject common name in this flow rather than making use of subject alternative name. So subject common name for the device is Pavan.territory. Now, the user or a computer authentication, because this was already joined to the Entra, I can actually basically submit both the user and certificate together during the TEAP authentication. But you might have to actually consider this. The allowed protocols by default will not be enabled with the EAP chaining. So under TEAP, you have a checkbox called EAP chaining. Make sure that you enable that. The next one is under certificate authentication profile, whether you wanted to change it to common name or subject alternative name, look at that and come down to the policies part of it. And if you look at the authorization, as long as it is a TEAP and a EAP-TLS authentication and your EAP chaining results gives me user and machine authentication, both of them succeeded, then only I wanted to give the employee access and employee SGT to it. Let's disable and enable the adapter so that it goes through the authentication again. Now you could see using that subject common name in the user certificate and the device certificate, it's a TEAP EAP-TLS, and it matched with whatever the policy that we have written, EAP-TLS employee. Now let's go to the details of it. If you look at the chaining result, both the user and machine authentication was successful. You could see that both the subject names are retrieved and passed, and it's going to be queried using the REST ID mechanism. If you come down all the way below, ISE is querying the Entra to retrieve the groups and the attributes around it and give the authorization. So that's how you can validate your configuration. Now, on top of all this, we come down to a third stage where what are the Intune integrations possible on top of this? Of course, you can make use of Intune at any whatever use cases that I demonstrated earlier. For how do you configure Intune? How do you actually issue the certificate? We have two webinars, excellent webinars done already earlier. In 2023 or 2022 timeframe, Greg gave a webinar around ISE integration with Intune MDM. And I, around 2 months back, I gave a webinar on the Cisco ISE update for Microsoft Security Identifiers, where I touched based on the earlier aspects also. So go and refer them if at all you have any doubts. Now, you know this EAP-TTLS+PAP Authentication Protocol. Basically, you are submitting not the certificate, you are submitting the EAP-TTLS, that means username and password over EAP-TTLS+PAP mechanism. So ISE has a visibility to MAC address of the device, not the certificate GUID. So MDM version 3 API is going to be used for querying based on the GUID imprinted under the certificate or the MDM. Because the certificate was not received from the user now, obviously we're going to make use of MAC address as that was received as part of the radius calling station ID to query the Intune, get the compliance, and give the authorization. And if I flip over the same thing with the EAP-TLS one also, based on the certificate that we received during the EAP-TLS, now because this flow is about EAP-TLS authentication, right? So ISE has the certificate of a user. Now, user certificate might be containing the GUID. Using that GUID, we're going to query the Intune to get the compliance of the device and get the authorization to it. The same is applicable for TEAP EAP-TLS as well. Basically, because you're getting the certificate, you're going to get the GUID from imprinted under that certificate, do the MDM v3 query using the GUID imprinted under that certificate, get the compliance and give the authorization. Now, even the TLS chaining concept also makes use of the same thing. But in the chaining concept, you have two modes, right? When you go through the chaining one, The first one, when the device gets authenticated, the device certificate was given to the ISE. So at that time, device certificate might be having the GUID in order to get the compliance of the device. Now, once after all the TEAP EAP chaining result was done also, you can also actually use the same GUID of the certificate to query the Intune, get the compliance, and give the authorization. So let's see it in the action. Until and unless you see it in the action, you will not be able to believe how it's working. So if I go through my MDM integration, I have only one MDM at this point of time, Intune. I've already configured this. Refer to my earlier webinar, how do you configure it? And I was making use of SAN URI GUID field to query the Intune, get the compliance. Make sure the MDM is successfully connected to the ISE environment, and then go look at the policies that I've written. And at the same policy set, now I have one more policy called EAP-TLS MDM employee. As long as it goes through the EAP-TLS authentication, plus MDM says it is compliant, I want to give the compliant access to. Now, if you look at the user certificate in my device, or a device certificate in my device, it has the subject alternative name with GUID imprinted into it. User principal name also imprinted, and plus GUID also was there as part of subject alternative name. So now when the device participates in the EAP-TLS authentication, ISE is going to receive the certificate, and certificate has that attribute, GUID attribute, based on which ISE is going to query the Intune and get the compliance of it. So now it's matching exactly what the policy that we have written based on the MDM compliance. It matched with the certificate authentication. If you come down, where is that? This is the GUID value. And let's look at the MDM properties. Where is that? Premier license is consumed. MDM query is also happening, but where is that? Let's copy this MAC address, or MDM device compliance query is happening towards the Intune in order to get the compliance of that endpoint. So let's go all the way up, copy the MAC address, go back to the context visibility, filter it out with using the MAC address. Let's look at the details. If you look at the details of this, there is an MDM attributes that we received. So MDM compliant is true, MDM enrollment is also true. So that was the reason why it matched with the whatever policy that we have created. Now, so far you have seen how to make use of ISE plus Entra ID, on top of it Intune for an MDM compliance. If people were making use of both Entra ID plus an Active Directory together, that becomes a hybrid environment. What are the use cases possible in the hybrid environment, especially the protocols? When I say protocol, if both the user and device is actually getting authenticated using the certificate-based authentication, but the user is basically in the Active Directory which was sent to the on-prem act, then it becomes one and the same. It's against Entra or against AD, you can do the same thing. But what is the significant factor? I'm going to touch base on that. As part of a device authentication, device certificate is going to be submitted to ISE. Once the certificate validation is done, the EAP chaining result is basically mission succeeded. Now you can give a separate authorization at this point of time as well, based on the EAP chaining result. If user is logged into the computer, then user is going to present the certificate, but the same certificate can be queried against Active Directory. Why is that? Because the certificate attribute that we received, ISE is going to grab that common name or a subject alternative name and does an external lookup whether that is available in the Active Directory or not. That was the reason why we were making use of an Active Directory to do an external lookup. And once the TEAP chaining result is successful, I can give the authorization based on that too, based on the received attributes and groups from the Active Directory, not based on the Entra ID. Now, if you have an environment where you don't want to get away, like a device are maintained with a certificate like TEAP, TLS, but the user was still making use of older methods like a MS-CAP V2s. Then in that case also, this hybrid environment is going to be helpful for you. Again, the device goes through the authentication using the device certificate, and then after user, he's going to submit the credentials at the time of login. Those credentials are going to be validated against AD, not against Entra, because against Entra, it's not possible for you to do the MS-CAP V2. So once the Active Directory gives me authorization, retrieves the groups, and I can give the authorization to it. So in a nutshell, if you compare all these protocols together, Active Directory, Entra, and a hybrid environment, these are the possible ways for you, and only one is not possible. Entra ID device group attributes authorization is not possible till date. It's going to come in ISE 3.5. Stay tuned. Hopefully, it's going to be in the GA release as well. So if we have that ability, then even based on the device in which group that it belongs to, device attributes, you can even write the policies. So far, you can only write the policies based on the user groups or user attribute certificate. So I wanted to actually touch base on the same thing. It's going to come in the 3.5, hopefully in the GA release. When it comes to the another aspect, remember one thing. When you integrate Intune, Intune can actually provision the certificate to the endpoints using the three methods that I was describing earlier in my webinar. Using the SCEP or PKCS or third-party SCEP servers that you are supposed to maintain your on-prem in order to provision the certificate, that's no longer needed. Microsoft introduced the Cloud PKI just 15 days back, not 15 days, 1.5 months back, April timeframe, through which you can actually provision the certificate to the managed devices directly. So you don't have to maintain the SCEP, PKCS, and third-party SCEP servers on-prem. Everything is going to be cloud-based. That's an interesting one, and we are still need to validate that, and hopefully we're going to come up with a short webinar around it down the line. With that, I'm going to come down to the resources for your reference. The one biggest part of it, whatever I talked throughout this session, you're going to go to the iceberg, do the filter based on the Entra, and you're going to find all those resources, whatever I demonstrated today.